Lav Diaz is an independent filmmaker from the Philippines who is best known for being a significant voice in slow cinema, or as he calls, emancipated cinema, a genre, so to speak, of art house film characterized by minimalist techniques, loose narratives, and long takes that encourage contemplation and observation from viewers. Other notable slow cinema filmmakers include Chantal Akerman, Wang Bing, Hugh Bo, Robert Bresson, Pedro Costa, Jacques Rivette, Andrei Tarkovsky, Bela Tarr, Tsai Ming Liang, Apichatpong Weerasethakul, and Edward Yang, among others. The cinema of Lav Diaz, in particular, is characterized by black and white digital photography, minimal camera movement, attention to the sociopolitical realities of the Philippines, such as the conditions of poverty and the scars of colonialism, as well as what is recognized as extremely long runtimes, at least relative to other films. Diaz alone has directed several of the longest narrative films to date, with at least 10 of his films exceeding 5 hours in length. So much fuss is made about Bela Tarr's Satan Tango being over 7 hours in length, but Lav Diaz's films, Melancholia, A Lullaby to the Sorrowful Mystery, Jeremias, Book 1, Legend of the Lizard Princess, Death in the Land of Encantos, and Evolution of a Filipino Family all surpass it in length. In particular, one cut of Evolution is just 17 minutes shy of 11 hours. Naturally, one might wonder the utility of such lengthy runtimes, especially when many of his slow cinema contemporaries generally stick to standard lengths of 1.5 to 3 hours, and are still able to accomplish a whole lot with less. In fact, Diaz's lengthy runtimes have a political drive behind them, functioning as an independent artistic protest to the standards and expectations imposed on artists to appeal to the consumer values of mass audiences and for the studio's profit incentive. Diaz resists these values in the interest of establishing his own voice, while also reclaiming the ancestral Malay identity of modern Filipino people, who were historically disinterested in the monetary value of art, something that is often forgotten due to centuries of exploitation and colonialism. Derived from King Felipe II of Spain, the etymology of the term Filipino is rooted in colonialism, and so the very Filipino identity is one defined by its history of Spaniards raping and pillaging their land. Furthermore, with so much of the country's history erased, the Malay identity, as it once was, remains something of legend and antiquity. In order for the audiences to confront the Filipinos' burden of suffering for centuries, Diaz makes his films long, slow, and miserable, despite whatever catharsis might come from his documentation and reverence for the collective Filipino identity and culture.
I'm capturing real time. I'm trying to experience what these people are experiencing. They walk. I must experience their walk. I must experience their boredom and sorrows. I want the audience to experience the afflictions of my people, who have been agonizing for so long. Under the Spaniards for more than 300 years. Under the Americans for almost 100 years till now. Under the Japanese people during World War II. And then under Marcos and his 14-year fascist dictatorship. I want people to experience our agony.
Yes, it's slow because, the orientation is that, But cinema's duration can only be 2 hours or 1.5, and you have to condense it, you have to abridge the whole thing into that. But, duration in cinema mustn't be imposed if you consider cinema as art. Art is free, man. Why confine it to a 2-hour thing or a 1.5-hour thing which is imposed by the market? This is an imposition by the so-called industry. The very word industry alone is very compromising. Is cinema an industry? Yes and no. Cinema can be culture. Cinema is art. It's not just the profit motive, man. But it's not slow cinema. It's a liberated kind of cinema. We're just emancipating cinema. So we're trying to emancipate it in a way that any filmmaker that will come now can just be free. Don't be confined with a 2-hour thing. If you want to make money, then go for it. You know, if you want to help culture, if you want to help humanity grow, then be free, man. Liberate cinema. It can be just 5 minutes, it's okay. Or 40 hours, it's okay. There's no short cinema or long cinema. It's just fucking cinema, man. Yeah. I hate that labeling of short film and long film. No, it's just cinema. Do you label a small, a small frame in painting as a small painting? It's not. It's painting. It's art.
It's worth noting that time itself is relative and measured and dictated by the whims of governing bodies, which explains the various disparities in time zones between countries. According to Diaz, the Malay people were not even bound to the concept of time in their pre-colonization state, but rather bound to space.
We Malays, we Filipinos, are not governed by the concept of time. We are governed by the concept of space. We do not believe in time. If you live in the country, you see Filipinos hang out. They're not very productive. That is very Malay. It is about space and nature. In the Philippine archipelago, nature provided everything until the concept of property came with the Spanish colonizers. Then the capitalist order took control. The concept of time was introduced to us when the Spaniards came. We had to pray at 6 o'clock and start work at 7. Before, it was free. It was Malay.
Therefore, to respect his own ancestral roots, Diaz commits himself to think outside of time in such rigorous conventional manners as dictated to him, all while committing himself to making films. During the Marcos regime, Diaz found himself inspired by the cinema of Lino Broca, because it revealed to him the potential for revolutionary action through the cinematic medium.
Cinema was just entertainment to me back then. No aesthetic issues yet. It was the height of the Marcos regime then. He was controlling everything. And Manila in the Claws of Light was liberating. In a sense that you can use this medium to fuck this regime. Insyang was also very influential. Insyang was not just talking about the dynamics of a mother-daughter conflict over a man. It's about what poverty can do to you and your psyche. A poverty born of neglect, of a system that doesn't work for the masses but maintains the status quo. Very feudal.
On the subject of poverty, I personally gravitate more towards the earlier films of Lav Diaz's than his newer ones, because the more support and funding that his films have, the more they begin to resemble an approximation of the formal conventions he resisted with such revolutionary fervor and sincere embrace of the aesthetics of poverty. This is not to suggest that Diaz's newer films suffer, as he is still one of the best directors working today despite everything, but there was something special to the less refined, bare-bones nature characterizing his films of the 2000s. Essentially, I miss the old Lav Diaz, though I admit I have yet to see many of his newer films, and what I have seen is still great. Likewise, it's reasonable to report that while I have devoted hours upon hours, and even days to his films, I have only seen about 1/4 of his output. Surprisingly, I've watched the nearly 7.5-hour film Melancholia twice now. Most recently with my girlfriend. The first time was actually as a dare in 2016 by a cinephile friend of mine who was first discussing the unrelated 2011 film of the same name by Lars von Trier. Funny enough, Diaz's film actually does make a cameo in Trier's film when one of the sisters searches about the planet Melancholia on the internet. For me, Melancholia by Lav Diaz began as an endurance test, but soon evolved into one of my favorite films. And while it took me another 7 years to watch it again, I kept the film on my mind by sharing and discussing it with others. Before you moralize me for distributing a rip of the film to others, it's important to note that despite his reluctance to allow his films to be hosted on platforms like YouTube in low compression states, Diaz, being the cool person that he is, supports film piracy.
Personally, I am not against piracy. Piracy is part of the cultural revolution in our country. It's a cultural revolution. It is very socialist, very equalitarian. Pirates are granting the masses access to films. Pirates are bringing films into people's homes. If it wasn't for piracy, how could these films reach people in the Philippines? What matters is that pirates are challenging the status quo. And by doing what they do, they are fighting the system. Feudalism and tyranny must be destroyed, starting from the streets where DVDs are sold for $1. It always starts from the streets, you know. That's why I love the pirates. They are more into the cultural revolution than the people in the academy or the status quo critics in the country.
Ha? Ito nga ho, oh. Masagit pa po sa halaga na binigay niyo kay Elisa ang mga ito eh.
Okay na, naapo, Diyos ko. Nasisiraan ka naman ng utak mo, ha? Nagsanla ka sa akin, tapos ibabayad mo, baby.
As the years passed, and I started watching more films from Diaz and his influences, Melancholia continued to cement itself as my all-time favorite film, with Evolution of a Filipino Family following fairly close behind. One reason for this is because of the politics and aesthetics of Lav Diaz's earlier artistic ventures that I've expressed so far. But what makes Melancholia stand out to me among the others, beyond my bias towards it being the first Diaz film that I saw, is how it explores identity specifically. In one way or another, all of Diaz's films deal with the theme of identity, as it relates to Filipino culture. And while Melancholia is still very much about the Filipino cultural identity, it also draws attention to a more universally applicable theme of identity being performance. The essence of an individual identity is defined by its social and biological disposition. What someone's chemical makeup is determines their identity. How someone is raised by their parents determines their identity. What cultural and class environment someone belongs to determines their identity. Indeed, every single person is unique in their own way, but what makes people different from another is determined by a series of different variables. Two people might have different interests or callings in life, but even those are determined by these variables, and we are granted only an illusion of relative autonomy to make choices. Different trajectories in life are ultimately determined by the aforementioned variables under the guise of autonomous choices. Upon first glance, this would explain the seemingly stark contrast between the two lead women in Melancholia's first hour or so, that the non-diegetic and almost stalkerish cameraman follows with unmasked footsteps. Initially, we might conclude that both women reach their respective social positions in life due to the poverty common to the Filipino town. Sister Carmela is a nun, while Janine is a prostitute. The surface identity to the women is determined by gender in relationship to men, both falling outside the general expectations for women to be mothers and wives, by taken to the church and taken to the streets in order to survive. Presumably, the nun practices celibacy, while the prostitute practices transactional sex. Sister Carmela collects charity donations for the poor, but is mocked by Janine and her new pimp, Danny Boy, who argue the charity is ultimately useless in the grand scheme of things.
Sa tingin ko, ang charity ninyo, panandabihan kanya. Hindi nakakatulong sa kahirapan niya.
Carmela rationalizes poverty, and by extension, the centuries of colonialist sins, as a way of being free of material possessions and being closer to God on a spiritual level.
Tao, ang sasagot lang. Isa lamang itong daan patungo sa
Meanwhile, the sex workers adopt a more nihilistic but also passively radical view of poverty being a justification to resist God's law and embrace a supposedly immoral lifestyle.
Mister, sabihin mo sa akin. Ano ang kasalanan ng
Whether it be determined by God or the devil, the natives or the colonizers, the oppressed or the oppressors, the establishment of these contrasting identities are both ways of coping with the situations at hand. This is where the film starts to get more interesting. I recommend you see the film for yourself, but for now, consider this a rare spoiler warning from me. In the interest of thorough analysis, I must give away some of the secrets revealed almost 2 hours in. Consider yourself warned. There is more than meets the eye for these three central characters, as evidently expressed through melancholic tears at different points. There's something slightly off about the characters and how they interact with one another. Janine is mistaken for a woman named Alberta by one of the mystery woman's friends.
Ano pangalan mo? Janine?
And when he asks for sex, she strips for him. He says he can almost say that she is Alberta, but the fact that she strips tells him that she isn't.
It's unbelievable. Kamukha mo talaga si Alberta. Pwede ko nga sabihin ko si Alberta eh. May umubad ka? Pag nagubad ka sa harap ko at handa akong gawin lahat ng gusto ko. Di nga ikaw si Alberta.
Another client of Janine's is an American sex tourist who scolds her for crying, but reluctantly pays her anyway, saying that he understands why someone might be remorseful for taking a seemingly shameful job as a whore, assuming an economic call to sex work.
I couldn't do it with you crying. That's a stupid question. Who doesn't resent being a whore?
Meanwhile, the rigorous routine practice of Catholic prayer and charity leads Sister Carmela to spiral into a state of depression, before eventually breaking character and visiting the prostitute. It is at this point that we learn that Sister Carmela was once a woman named Rena. Janine was indeed once Alberta, and Danny Boy was their mutual friend and psychological guide, Julian. In order to cope with the tremendous amount of grief, the women follow Julian's lead and undergo a strange form of performance therapy, adopting new personas to alleviate depression, think outside of themselves, gain insight about the world, and reach relative enlightenment.
5 persona na ang pinasok ko. Nurse, sales girl, hairdresser. Last year, baliw ako. Ngayon, madre. Next year, ano?
2 other patients of Julian reject their old personas in favor of new ones. The female patient tears pages from her Bible and consumes them, before literally shattering her reflection by dropping the mirror onto the ground. A presumably male patient partnered with her wears women's clothes, perhaps suggesting that he now lives as a crossdresser or a transgender woman. The two are partnered together, and their new personas have sex. The actual personas and what they entail differ greatly from one another. After adopting a series of other personas over the course of a 5-year period, Alberta takes the form of Janine, modeled off of her prostitute goddaughter, Hannah, in an effort to feel her pain and live her experiences.
Hannah, sandali na! Mother, ako lang.
May connection ba kay Hana ang personang hooker na pinili mo sa Sagada?
Gusto kong maramdaman yung sakit na dinaranas ng anak ko. Bakit siya naging hooker? Bakit niya winawasak yung sarili ng ganun?
Naramdaman mo?
Definitely.
Indeed, this does give her more perspective and allows her to get closer with Hannah after returning home and reuniting with her. As Danny, Julian urges the women not to ever break character, to truly embody their chosen personas and leave the people they once were behind until the evaluation period.
Julian.
Who the fuck is Julian? I am not Julian!
After seeing Julian, now Danny, put on a live sex show, like those shown to his Japanese customers, the women are disturbed by Julian's commitment to the persona. Alberta notes that even as a prostitute, she was shocked by the intensity of his performance.
The house is still coming. Tell me. Can you save the world from sinners like you? Like this woman beside you? This couple? Hey, come on! Hey!
Yung sa'yo, wow. Scary yung immersion mo sa bugaw. Yung turuhan, nung nakita ko yun. Unbelievable. I was shocked kahit naputa na ako nun.
Meanwhile, the sensitive Rena runs away and is eventually found dead. We might speculate that Rena, or Sister Carmela, is too sensitive to go through with the performance therapy, seeing that she broke character and broke down. But her natural sensitivity is possibly a byproduct of living as a nun, one who intends to live solely to honor God and give to others. Her charity work is now her life. So if the charity is worthless, so is she. Yes, I am making the case that Rena, or Carmela's, breakdown comes more from a political confrontation of her identity than actually abandoning her actual identity. Any identity she adopts is an approximation of who she is as a person. And the same can be said about Alberta/Janine and Julian/Danny.
Hindi ko na kaya mag-kunwari, Alberta. Ina, hindi ka nagkukunwari. Totoong madre ka. Naniniwala ka madre ako? Oo. So, totoong puta ka?
Oo, puta ko. Dalawang lalaki na nga gumagalaw sa akin.
Okay na. Nagpagalaw ka? Ha?
During the evaluation, Alberta is frustrated with Julian for suggesting that she did not fully commit to the persona of Janine, seeing that in addition to consoling Rena and calling for Julian, she also operated on selective immersion and found his immersion too extreme. He believes that it was not too extreme because, given the nature of their personas, it is simply the truth of their identities.
Sa perspective ko, hindi sobra yun. Sa principle ng proseso natin, hindi sobra yun. It's yun. Truth ang personang pinasok ko, Alberta. Truth.
Alam ko.
It is within the nature of Danny to be that extreme. Presumably, it is in the nature of Janine to be that extreme too, but she failed to fully commit, to fully immerse herself in that persona. To avoid extremity and remain comfortable is to limit yourself and only reach a hyper-real approximation of truth, which is arguably fake.
Yan klaseng immersion yan kung selective ang approach. Hypocritical, di ba? Fake. lies ang lalabas. Wala man lang approximation ng truth. And that's wrong.
Julian's idea of successfully constructing and immersing oneself to an alternate persona necessitates reaching extremity. Meanwhile, Alberta counter-argues that one can still be selective and not result in dishonesty, as she feels she experienced truth and not lies from her previous and tamer personas, in addition to the role of Janine.
I don't think hypocritical ang proseso kung magiging selective ka. I don't think lies ang lalabas kung magiging selective ka. I don't think it's wrong. I experienced truth by being selective in all the 5 personas na pinasok ko.
If correct, then Alberta truly was Janine. She was really a prostitute, albeit a reluctant and selective one. And not just because of who she slept with and how she dressed. With only brief exceptions, her commitment to the role was genuine. So much so that it is disingenuous to say that Janine is Alberta, because they were able to successfully separate themselves from their individual personas.
Parang sinasabi mo na walang truth yung immersion na ginawa ko? Fake yung immersion ko? Fake yung pagpapakantot ko sa mga lalaki? Fake yung pagmumolestya nila sa akin? My God, Julian. For 1 whole week, totoo akong puta sa sagada.
The question I am, however, left with is how much of Alberta, Julian, and Rina are just as much personas as their immersed doubles, Janine, Danny, and Sister Carmela. If we accept that truth, for as much as truth is even a thing, can be reached under their new personas, can it be reason that their assigned names and roles, and by extension the trajectories they have developed over the years, are just as much fake and selective approximations of truth as Julian feared his patient was? How people navigate in their respective cultures is through performance, by means of establishing and evolving identities with the interest of self-fulfillment and often the desired fulfillment of others. Whether we are active or passive, we perform in life according to our surroundings, and we evolve in accordance with desired progress with our immersed personas.
Tulungan mo ako, sister. Impyerno ang bayang ito, sister. Impyerno ang mundong ito, sister.
Furthermore, Melancholia does not shy away from exposing viewers to its various layers of identity, going so far as to hardly hide the fact that the film is staged, passively exposing its own artifice, and the fact that the performers are double performing, and that Lav Diaz is incorporating details of his own life, such as his communist friends being lost in the mountains. There is also a brief narrative detour that invites metatextual inquiry over the detailed descriptions provided about a novel that Julian's friend is writing. The book follows an acclaimed B-movie director in the Philippines who is secretly gay, and uses action films as an excuse to be close to strong men. He enters a love affair with one of his lead actors, who fatally dies in a car crash. The director enters an introspective period in his life, and devotes himself to philosophy and politics before making a comeback to cinema, and releasing a documentary about the sins of the film industry, in pushing propaganda on the people, and reinforcing a culture of political passivity in the Philippines.
Ang ginawa niyang pamagat ay The True History of Philippine Cinema. Dito sa dokumentaryong ito, pinakita niya kung gaano kalaki ang kasalanan ng movie industry sa kinahinatnan ng ating bayan. Kung bakit naging napaka-bansot ng kamalayan ng mga mamamayan, kung bakit napaka-dysfunctional ng ating bayan.
The director eventually comes out of the closet, begins wearing women's clothes, perhaps meaning that they are transgender, and devotes themselves to producing politically conscious, independent films. While there is enough creative liberties in the interest of plausible deniability, The author's description of the novel has undeniable parallels to the lives and career trajectories of Lav Diaz and Lino Brocka. Like the fictional actor, Lino Brocka was a gay man who died in a car accident, which is likely the source of inspiration here. Old interviews reveal that Diaz has a wife and kids, although little information is actually made public about his private life and whether or not there's a possibility of personal queerness or if it's mere solidarity. What we do know is that he both politically and artistically supports the plights of women and queer people. Norte to the End of History was even co-written by a transgender person, who also made an appearance in the film.
Ano bang problema, Fabian Biduya?
Gusto ko sana mangutang sa inyo mga sir eh.
Ayun! Sir.
Ay, ma'am pala,
Sir.
ma'am.
Ako, wala.
Hindi, bibili lang ako ng libro at saka mandagdag lang dun sa rent. Babayaran ko naman sa sweldo.
The woman who left also featured a transgender character.
Walanda, hindi maganda ang ginawa sa'yo.
Mas maganda ko kung pinatay na lang ako ng mga hayop na yun.
Ay, anak. Magsalita ng ganyan. Ganyan.
A part of the building is being used by transgenders. They have this show every night there. So it's surreal.
Yes,
it's very farcical.
We can only respectfully speculate so much about a person's private life, but the connections between Lino Brocka and Lav Diaz's public life and artistic output, and details of the fictional novel, are too evident to deny. The fictional director's shift away from entertainment and towards tools for political commentary mirror the evolution of Diaz's engagement with art at a young age, after seeing the works of Brocka.
So malinaw itong kaso ng talagang lantarang paglapastangan sa karapatan ng mga film artists. Huwag matakot! Kami sa industriya ng pelikula ay nakikiisa sa mga karapatan na kailangang ipaglaban ng mga tao sa ating lipunan.
When the character describes the fictional documentary within his fictional novel, within this film, Diaz simultaneously describes his own work, and films like Evolution of a Filipino Family and Melancholia in particular. Indeed, both of those films are discourses on truth and the importance of aesthetic pursuit in cinema.
In a nutshell, the novel is a discourse on truth and the importance of aesthetic pursuit in cinema. That's it.
I'm honing in on the scene to make sense of its narrative utility, and my conclusion is that Diaz is using the triple contextualization of art, fictional documentary inside fictional novel inside actual film, as a way to engage with the discourse on truth in relationship with art, and thereby project himself onto, into, and through the art. In a sense, through his fictional characters and stories, and the layers within, Lav Diaz is constructing his own approximation of truth, selectively so, and creating new personas. Therefore, a character like Alberta is very much a wholly unique character, and very much an extension of Diaz himself. Likewise, the non-diegetic presence of the sounds of rain trickling on the cameraman's footsteps, and wind blowing directly in the microphone can be dismissed as being weak form on Diaz's part, or rationalized as merely emancipating the aesthetic of poverty. But it also serves a metatextual function, inviting viewers to question if the diegetic world of the film is sufficiently immersed, as a truth within itself. In actuality, the more that the artifice of the in-text world is exposed by the apparent presence of Lav Diaz's digital camera, we ironically come closer to accepting that Melancholia itself is a documentary, like most films are, by virtue of being a documentary of performance. I believe that cinema should be used as an artistic tool to confront reality, rather than a tool to escape it. The notion that a film must adhere to a specific set of formal criteria and not break the illusion and show the strings is often rooted in the assumption of escapism, in addition to classist standards for formal quality. This is why the most formally postmodern films are those that interrogate hyperreality. and explore the lines between performance and non-performance, whether it be by the actor, the cameraman, or the editor. Such films include Ingmar Bergman's Persona. They're quasi-documentaries about film itself by Iranian second-wave filmmakers like Abbas Kiarostami, when he's not plagiarizing, Jafar Panahi, and Mohsen Makhmalbaf, and his daughter Samira Makhmalbaf, as well as select avant-garde films by leftist filmmakers such as Jean-Luc Godard, Jacques Rivette, Peter Watkins, Kaveh Zahedi, and duo Jean-Marie Straub and Danielle Houlet, My French Sucks, or even the relatively mainstream found footage subgenre of horror films such as The Blair Witch Project, Paranormal Activity, and Link Mungo. The films of Elaine Fuentes also touch on that, but I'm biased there. All of the aforementioned works may have varying levels of depth of intended political and formal critique, but their very existence invites interrogation of their form. The conclusion of engaging with such works should be redirecting our means of engaging with more supposedly formally sound text that are mere performances thought to be fiction. Because just about all films are documentaries, if only because they document performance. The artifice is always there. We just suspend our belief, rather than disbelief, and segregate documentary from performance in our heads, in the interest of escapism. In actuality, the performance is just as much a truth as it is a lie. It is, therefore, an approximation of truth, a morsel of reality copied by light and played back to us 24 frames a second.
La photographie, c'est la vérité. Et le cinéma, c'est 24 fois la vérité par seconde.
Film ist 24 Mal die Lüge in der Sekunde im Dienste der Wahrheit. Oder im Dienste des Versuchs, die Wahrheit zu ergründen. Ne? Also, weil ich weiß auch nicht, was die Wirklichkeit ist.
I see why you like this video camera so much.
You do?
It's not quite reality.
Reality says we gotta move.
No, but it's totally like a filtered reality, man. It's like you can pretend everything's not quite the way it is.
Il n'y a pas de différence entre la réalité et la fiction, parce que le cinéma, c'est la réalité qui s'exprime par soi-même. Dans la réalité, je peux photographier un homme qui promène dans la rue, il n'a pas conscience d'être filmé, et ça, c'est la réalité. Si j'ai choisi un acteur pour faire cet homme-là, alors il y a une autre réalité, la réalité de l'acteur. C'est toujours la réalité, c'est jamais la fiction.
Suspended belief and relative attempts of escapism render cinema as performance itself, while performance might reveal a repressed truth, as Alberta and Julian argue. It simultaneously represses another, thereby rendering truth lies, and lies truth. In the world of Melancholia, all truth is a lie, and the only hope is through self-expression, through performance, through art. However, this hope is a dead end because art only really flourishes when there is first sadness and despair. That is what Angelo believes.
Dahil sa kalungkutan, may tula. Dahil sa kalungkutan, may kanta. Dahil sa kalungkutan, may pelikula. Dahil sa kalungkutan, may pinta. Dahil sa kalungkutan, may nobela. Hindi ba katotohanan yun?
This is also something that's expressed in the extended scenes at night in the jungle, with Alberta's long-lost lover, Renato, who treks through the reeds alongside other communist freedom fighters. Renato maintained hope by writing letters to Alberta. Letters that would never be sent.
Mahal kong Alberta. Dumaragata ngayon ang bagyo dito. Pansamantalang naantala ang pagtulog nila sa amin. Nakakataon din makapagpahinga kami ng kaunti. Wala nang katilakan ng lahat. Nakaamba na ang kamatayan.
However, even he gives up on the one thing that kept him going, as he tears the pages and throws them into the stream.
Ngayon ko natanto ang natulaing kahangalan ng pakikibakang ito. Tungkol lamang ito sa kalungkutan. Tungkol ito sa kalungkutan ko. Tungkol ito sa hapit ng aking bayan. di hindi ko na magawang maging romantisista sa kabiguang ito. Kahit ang walang kapantay na kagandahan ng pulong ito ay walang sagot sa impyerno nito. Wala akong nakikitang gamot sa kalungkutan ito.
Soldiers and indigenous tribal men carry Renato's body by horse and perform a death ritual consisting of music and dance. This rare moment of catharsis not only reinforces the idea that art is birthed from sadness and or grief, but also that death ought to be celebrated as a relief to the misery of one's own perception of truth and reality. The Philippines and the Filipino identity were constantly pushed to absolute extremes to reinvent themselves, whether it be politically dictated or culturally compelled as a coping mechanism, in order to adapt to the changing and devastated cultural climate. Paradoxically, the Philippines also struggles to reinvent itself and progress because of its history of being exploited and scarred. On that point, Lav Diaz's From What Is Before is set during the 1970s, but was shot in the 2010s, and yet the director did next to nothing differently to sell the time period, believing almost nothing has changed in the span of time, in spite of the rise and fall of the Marcos regime.
Like with From What Is Before, I'm looking for a place where it looks like the late 60s, on the early 70s. And we found this place in the northern part of the country, which is a very neglected place. It still looked like the 60s, like the 70s. It's totally fucked up, yeah. So we went there to shoot this. We didn't change anything. There's no real, design to do.
Yeah.
To change this thing. It's there. It's just there.
Are there many places like that still
Of course,
in the Philippines?
yeah. Yes,
so
yes,
you
yes.
could do time travel, basically.
Yeah.
When you
There's
leave
a lot
the
of that.
urbanized areas.
Yes, there's a lot of that. It's the issue of neglect is very rampant in our culture. It's a totally fucked up culture. Yeah.
Revolution brings the nation a catharsis in the moment, but a culture so devastatingly exploited and scarred is left passive and numb, repressing trauma instead of learning and growing from it. I make sense of Diaz's aesthetic pursuit of truth and identity through art as predictably reflecting the cultural history of the Philippines. Melancholia operates primarily as a meditation on the sadness that overcame the country and its people over the course of various key stages of its history, from Spanish colonialism to American capitalism, and martial law under Marcos's regime.
One could say your big subject actually is the history of the Philippines, or the Filipino experience actually is maybe even a better way to put it. Or as you called it yesterday in the introduction, the Filipino nightmare.
Yeah. Martial law, yeah. It was a nightmare. It was the worst period of our history. It was a very dark period. It was the worst cataclysm that happened in our history. Like thousands upon thousands of Filipinos were tortured. They went missing during the Marcos years. And until now, there are a lot of missing persons, desaparecidos, until now.
Naging aktibo sina Renato at Alberta sa protesta, sa mga rallies. Lalong-lalo na si Renato. Hanggang sa namundok si Renato sa isang enkwentro sa isang isla sa Mindoro. Napatay si Renato. Di na nanganap ang bangkay niya. Pati ng mga kasama niya.
With this state of mind, the Malay identity represses itself in order to move forward, not progressing, but aimlessly walking through hell on earth, like a smiling nun with a charity basket, down towards the path of suicide. These reinvented, sluggish, passive, and suicidal states parallel the alternate personas in Melancholia, because rather than confront history and reality, they turn a blind and passive eye to it, because that is how they can reach a false sense of relative autonomy in this bleak world, and find a sense of control in this reality by seemingly redefining it. The issue with reinvention, and more specifically, reinvention seen through the personas shown in the film, is they require a divorce from one's history in favor of taking on new identities, cultural or individual, and this coping mechanism is built on passivity and repression. In the end, Alberta confronts the man who was once Julian, a published author with a god complex, but also a suicidal depressive, a hollow shell of his former self. Alberta tells him he is not God, and he is Julian, and needs to get over his dead wife already. He repeatedly utters, "I am not Julian." He is wrong, but he is also not wrong. He is broken, psychologically and spiritually, by both outside social conditions and by his own choices. He reinvents himself to cope, but it was always just a cope that makes him worse. Alberta was right that his therapy was a failure, insofar as it didn't make him or anyone else better as a result, but it was also proved a success, because Julian suffers no longer instead, because we can't necessarily call this person Julian any longer. Even if a new sincerity can be reached through performance, Melancholia will surely follow.
Malamig ang hangin, malamig ang puso, matamlay ang langit, matamlay ang himig, hinahanap, hanap kita, hinahanap, hinahanap.
There's no short cinema or long cinema, it's just fucking cinema, man.